What is up, guys? Welcome back to another GeekaWhat video. In this video, I'm going to be building an awesome gaming PC build for 2022 and beyond. This awesome future-proof system features one of Intel's brand new 12th gen i5 CPUs, DDR5 memory, and an RTX 3060 Ti. In this video, I'll be running you through all of the components I selected for this build and why, as well as diving into some performance later to test out just how well it performs. Let's do this. Now I'm going to kick this build off a little bit differently by talking through all of the components first and building it in just a moment. With 8 or 9 key components that make this build possible, it's important to get the right parts to avoid a bottleneck, where one piece of hardware slows another piece of hardware down. At the heart of this build is the processor, the i5-12600K. One of Intel's brand new CPUs, it features their snazzy efficiency and performance core technology and gives you some really great single and multi-threaded clock speeds. Perfect for the latest games like Call of Duty Vanguard and Battlefield 2042. To seed our CPU, we need one of the latest next-gen motherboards, and that's where this MSI Z690 Tomahawk Wi-Fi comes in. Now this board has overclocking support for both the CPU and your memory. It's got one of the best BIOS on the market, allowing you to easily overclock your RAM and configure your boot settings without too much of a hassle, and it supports the latest PCIe Gen 4 and 5 standards. A neutral aesthetic, built-in I/O shield with USB-C, really does tick all of the boxes that we'd want for a build like this. Oh, and as far as Z690 goes, it doesn't break the bank. One huge advantage of a newer motherboard is support for super fast SSDs, and that's where the next part comes in. Seagate's Firecua 530. With a great processor and awesome motherboard, we now want some super fast storage. The latest GPUs are so powerful that you need a good SSD, otherwise this can become a bottleneck. If it can't quite read the game files fast enough, you may actually find yourself dropping frames, something we definitely don't want to happen. With our long-term permanent storage sorted out, what about that super fast temporary storage that we call RAM or memory? This 32GB kit from Corsair of their Vengeance DDR5 is one of the best value DDR5 kits on the market. As a technology, this kit is a little bit new. DDR5's not had a great deal of time to mature, but it still delivers some awesome performance. And you can check out our take on DDR5 memory in a video in the card section now. So we've got all this great hardware, but what are we actually going to couple it with as far as the graphics card goes? Well, the most important part of any gaming PC build, we've picked up the RTX 3060 Ti, specifically MSI's awesome Gaming X Trio card. For these latest RTX 3000 series GPUs, you need to pair them up with powerful hardware, especially for 1080p gaming, where the CPU is more important than ever. Fortnite 1080p competitive settings, anyone? This card performs super well, and while stock and availability of GPUs is still really poor, and in all honesty, we haven't got an answer or solution to that ourselves, it should improve as we continue through the course of 2022. The last two components to cover off are our power supply and our CPU cooler. Now the new Intel chips consume a bit more power than the last gen, and definitely run hotter than the CPUs we've seen in the past, meaning a 240 or in our case 280mm all-in-one cooler is a really sensible choice. It will keep the processor nice and cool, prevent thermal throttling, where the CPU has to slow down to stop itself from overheating, and it also means we can get a bit of overclocking headroom. Plus, support for NZXT cam is always a bonus, and the RGB on this unit looks awesome. Finally then, to power everything up is NZXT's C750. This is a 750 watt unit with an 80+ gold certification and fully modular interface. Put simply, it's got 750 watts of maximum output, a high efficiency rating, and allows you to only plug in the cables you'll actually need, keeping cable clutter and all that jazz to a minimum. And as far as the parts go, that pretty much wraps it. No! We have the case. We haven't talked too much about this, NZXT's H510 Flow. Now a case is basically what holds all of your components. Pretty self-explanatory, right? But there are a lot of choices out there, and you can make the wrong ones if you're not careful. NZXT have a great name, and the H510 Flow adds an airflow twist to the highly successful H510 series, keeping temperatures low, important for the new Intel CPU, while also giving us that nice aesthetic wow factor. I've tried to go for an NZXT ecosystem in this build, not because I'm a great NZXT fanboy, they make some great products, but because it just ties in, it just looks all that little bit better. Now for this build, I'm going to go ahead and install as many components as I can into the motherboard to begin with. That includes our CPU, RAM and SSD. Building as much as we can out of the case makes our life a lot easier later. Trust me, that is a lesson I learnt the hard way. I've got to give a big shout out to MSI and a couple of other manufacturers for lending out the parts that make this video possible. They haven't got to approve it or anything like that before it goes live, and all opinions are our own. But by lending out the components, they make our life a lot easier and make it so that we can actually afford to put these videos together. Now this Tomahawk board has a really nice all black aesthetic that visually will work really well. Our case has some white accents, but the motherboard tray, where our board is installed, is black, making this, I think, a better choice. Installing the latest range of LGA 17, 18, 1900 CPUs is actually pretty simple. Pull back the retention arm on your CPU socket and pull this up. The socket itself will then lift nice and easily, kind of in a butterfly motion. Rather than hinging from the same point, it hinges from the opposite side. We're then able to nice and easily slide the CPU into place, with it sitting in nice and securely. Give it a gentle wiggle if you wish, but don't apply any pressure or force, and the black protective cover will pop off. Keep this safe just in case. Once the CPU is in, we can move on to the RAM or the memory. Now DDR5 is definitely not as mature as DDR4, but that's okay. It still provides good performance gains, and as the speeds increase and cache latencies decrease, we should see ever better performance. Something that really will take the great performance of the 12th gen chips and crank it up a notch. Once your memory's in, we can then move on to the SSD. Now this is a brand new drive from Seagate, their Firecua 530. Fantastic read and write speeds of about 7 gigabytes a second make it perfect. And this non-heatsink version works for us, as we'll be installing it, as you can see, under the top slot. They do a heatsink version though, in case you want to pop it in a PS5 for example. Something I did in a recent partnership with eBuy.com. Lovely stuff. Once that's in, we can move on to the next component today, our case. Can you tell our workout? Now this right here is the NZXT H510 Flow. We talked about this earlier. Awesome case that actually doesn't break the bank. My only criticism of it would be that it only comes with 2 fans as standard, and they're not RGB, so they look rubbish. But that's not to bother. We're going to pop in a cooler with some RGB fans anyway, solving our airflow issues. I know I said I'm not an NZXT fanboy, Dan, but I am so an NZXT fanboy. Right, so we can go ahead and actually pop the motherboard into the case. You'll then see we've got a number of different screw holes. I'll point these out with a screwdriver, but basically we've got one up here, one here, and one here. So 3 across the top. We've then got 3 across the middle, but the middle one is actually blocked out to hold the motherboard in place, so don't worry about that. And then we also have 3 at the bottom. 1, 2, 3. Nicely done. We're just going to go ahead and put some screws in each of those to fasten the board into place. The built-in rear I/O shield means we haven't got to bother with that either, and it just sits in. There's not really any way of making this more complicated. Quite a simple build today, actually. With 5 of our 8 components installed, next up is the CPU cooler. And for this, you'll need a bag of mounting hardware, which is compatible with these new Intel processors. Most coolers should ship with this by now, but just double check with your manufacturer and your retailer to make sure you don't end up in a bit of hot bother later on. Inside this bag, you'll find yourself a back plate, which will pop behind the motherboard. You'll find a metal plate, which will go on top of the CPU water block. And then you'll also find these male-to-male posts, which we'll use to secure the cooler down. Begin by popping the back plate through the rear of your motherboard and add in the male-to-male posts on top. We'll finish up the CPU water block installation in a moment's time. Before that, we need to go ahead and take these thumb screws for the front radiator mount. We're going to undo these just by hand or with a screwdriver, and then this will pop out of the case. We can install the radiator onto this here and then slide the complete assembly into the chassis. It will make things a lot easier for us later down the line. Trust me. We're going to pop the radiator on this side with the fans on the other side, sort of forming a bit of a sandwich. And you should see what I mean as we go ahead and actually get it done. Once we've done that, we can return it back into the case and finish off the water block. Once the cooler's in then, we can wrap things up by installing the GPU and then in a moment, the power supply. We talked about this card earlier in the video, but it's a great option for those looking to game at 1080p super high frame rates, but also people looking to dabble in a bit of 1440p gaming as well. A really great GPU, and I'm hoping it's actually going to fit in the case. I guess there's only one way to find out, especially with the radiator at the front. Oh my goodness, that could not be any tighter if I tried. There we go. Let's push the retention clip back, slide the GPU in, and with a bit of luck, that's not going in. There we go, it was just a little bit stiff. I actually think that this build is really well proportioned. It looks fantastic with this two-tone black and white aesthetic, and the components inside fit really really well. I guess it's time then just to wire the GPU up with our power supply, NZXT C750, which will also provide power to our CPU and motherboard, before going ahead and booting this machine up, testing it out with a load of the latest titles, and then of course seeing how well it performs. Before any of that though, it's time to see how good the system looks in an epic glam montage. Enjoy some awesome visuals of this 3060 Ti system, and we'll see you in a second. Nice! Now that we've seen just how good this system looks when it's all powered up, it's time to take a dive into the world of performance. On your screen now, as usual, you'll find a summary of all the different gaming benchmark tests we ran, all the frame rate numbers we were able to achieve. This gives you a headline view of the system's overall power, but as always I'll be diving into a few of these titles one by one, starting off with GTA 5. A bit of a classic title at this point, but here at 1440p high settings we tested the game out in the in-game benchmarking mode. We managed to achieve 151 frames per second on average, with strong 90 and 99th percentile results too. It was a similarly positive story in Battlefield, where at 1440p high settings with DLSS enabled and set to performance mode, we managed to achieve 103 frames per second on average. 93 and 71 for the 90 and 99th percentiles were also a pretty good showing, and visually we were really impressed. Call of Duty's Vanguard is also a good test of a system's performance, and one of the newest titles out there. It's important that PCs can run the game without a hitch. Thankfully this system can. 1440p high settings with DLSS enabled gave us 155 frames per second on average. Moving on to Forza Horizon 5 next up, here at 1440p Ultra, we managed to achieve 100 frames per second on average. 96 and 88 for the 90 and 99th percentile results also gave us some consistent frame rates. That's not all though, as Halo Infinite, our next game today, also gave us some great results. We tested this title at 1440p high settings and got just shy of 100 frames per second, 98 on average to be precise. All of our frame rates were measured as usual with NVIDIA FrameView and MSI Afterburner's Riva Tuner. Moving on to Apex Legends next up, here we tested at 1440p high settings and managed to achieve just shy of 140 frames per second. Once again, visually, the game looked pretty great in my opinion, and the frame rates were consistent across the board. Finally, the last game we tested out was Fortnite. Here at 1080p competitive settings, so basically everything tuned down to low, render distance set to far at full 1080p HD, we got 227 FPS on average. A really, really great result for this system. But with that though, that pretty much wraps it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to get subscribed. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.